My name is Jerm. This is Jerm Warfare, the battle of ideas.
Cynthia Chung, thank you for joining me in the trenches. I loved this massive Substack piece of yours. It's ginormous. It takes a long time to get through. And the short story, quote unquote, social credit scoring in China is actually a Western invention. I was in China for almost a month last year, as you know. And I've been to a bunch of cities, and I didn't notice any of this totalitarian hellhole social credit scoring that I constantly hear about. However, and it's a little bit ambiguous. So social credit scoring does exist in China, and it also doesn't. So that nuance is something I think we need to clarify just before we go any further.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. Well, there's the social credit system, which is what I'm going to focus on talking about today, which is really from the big tech, fintech companies, such as Alibaba in particular is a lot more notorious in China, but Tencent also is a part of this. And for people who don't know, Alipay is through Alibaba, WeChat, WePay is through Tencent, and they basically have a monopoly on like everything: shopping, entertainment, film, video games, all of the stuff that you could possibly find online. People are pretty much using Alibaba or Tencent platforms in China. And especially for like communication, pretty much everybody uses WeChat from what I've heard. So that is the social credit system that I kind of justified giving China a bad rap. As we're going to see in our discussion, China actually clamped down on this in 2020, but it was an Anglo-American construct to begin with. Then there's this other element, which you could say is within the legal system, and that's for like a whole other conversation, but Matt actually did a really good overview of it if people want to refer to that. I'm going to be going, because this is actually part one of a 4-part series. So even though you said it was very long, it's going to be like massive. It's probably going to be a book by the end of all of this. We're definitely going to make a few films from this. But Matt did do an overview on the legal system within China, which turns out to also be a lot of hot air in terms of like removing your rights if you do something wrong, sort of thing. But there's a lot of cheap shots with China, and with the big tech social credit thing, that was also like overly dramatized, because even with that, with Alibaba and Tencent, it was basically just a reward and punishment system that they have like an algorithm on how to judge these sorts of things. And because they started to also give out loans, and so people were getting penalties if they were late or if they were not paying the loan or whatever. And so you weren't getting certain kinds of deals on these platforms, like, because there's like, you can say discounts, or you can even have like discounts on an apartment for rent that's like being offered. There are some like pretty good deals, it seems, on these platforms, or you would be banned from using the platforms. But these are not like essential things, right? These are, again, entertainment, shopping, social media type stuff. And China clamped down on them doing that, but that was really what the social credit system is. As we're going to see, though, it did start out sort of innocently, but as these companies, because in the West, we have Google Pay and we have Apple Pay that have really taken over as well in the United States. Unlike Alibaba and Tencent as a fintechs, they don't have the right to give out loans just yet. And in the case of Alibaba and Tencent, they were acting as quasi-banks, which again is what China clamped down on in 2020. But you can see where the direction is headed, that if Google Pay and Google Pay and Apple Pay are controlling so much, and other types of entities are controlling so much of how we're paying for things, and the kind of platforms, shopping and so forth. Everything is becoming a lot more online, especially since COVID. That when you start, or like how you order food, or things like this, if you are starting to get banned from these platforms based on a reward punishment system of a social credit, which we actually do have in the West, which I will also go through, and that's the level of hypocrisy of this whole thing, is that big tech, it's the social credit system was started by these Western fintech companies, and they continue in the West, whereas China clamped down on it in 2020. But for this one, I wanted to just focus on the fintech companies, Alibaba and Tencent, and to go over this crazy story that is the financial crisis also that hit China with these fintech loans, P2P loans, has a lot of overlap and similarity to the Western 2008 financial crisis, and the fact that this was clearly engineered as an attack on not just China's banking system, it's any country that these predatory loans are operating in, including the United States. So what I've seen in the research that I've done is that these P2P loans, which started out in 2005, and it started in the UK with Zopa, which actually had its earned a banking license as well. So that's another problem, is that these fintech companies are actually, especially in Europe, they're called like neobanks, and they can get banking licenses even though they're not really a bank. And obviously that's going to make it really hard for small to medium-sized banks to operate. And these fintech lenders were caught several times, giving out predatory loans basically, and they didn't have what we call skin in the game, where you're giving out a huge amount of loans, but if there is a mass default on these loans, you don't actually hold any responsibility. So obviously, this isn't a great situation. And Zopa ultimately is an arm of Prudential, which is an old bank. You have HSBC, Standard Chartered, Prudential, who are all British opium banks that were started during the Opium War era. And that's a really important part of the story as well. Like, Hong Kong, for instance, was a British colony for 99 years. It only was returned to China in 1997. Taiwan is a separate government as well because of the civil war between Mao and Chiang Kai-shek. And, Chiang Kai-shek started a different government in Taiwan, but we have like these different systems. And in the case of Hong Kong, to this day, we have two British opium banks, HSBC and Standard Chartered, that controlled 2/3 of the Hong Kong money supply, like for printing Hong Kong money. So that just tells you how much, power and influence these British banks still have. So Prudential is another opium bank, and they started Zopa. They are focusing mostly on African and Asian markets. So you can see the P2P loans, they started in 2005 in the UK. That year in San Francisco, you had Prosper. And then in 2006, you had Lending Club. They both were started in San Francisco. And this was perfect timing because then you had the 2006 to 2008 explosion of the US financial crisis. And these kinds of predatory lenders were actually riding that wave and were not only making it worse, but they were preying off of people who were going to be in an extra vulnerable situation. Because of the financial crisis, it was going to be harder for them to have money for whatever reasons, but especially for businesses. But individuals as well were caught, having no choice but to go to these kinds of lenders because they couldn't get approved by banks. And we see it happening again right now because there is a private credit bubble in the US that's ready to explode. And again, you have predatory lenders like Blackstone and stuff that are once again involved in this that were the same players during the 2008 financial crisis.
Hold on. You said Blackstone. Don't you mean BlackRock?
Blackstone is like the largest landlord in the world.
Right. Okay.
They're buying up a whole bunch of assets, but especially like houses. So they made a killing off of the 2008 crash, and BlackRock was born out of Blackstone, and BlackRock also plays a role in the story. But it really seems the timing of all of this seems highly suspect, and Goldman Sachs also plays a really big role in the 2008 financial crash, where the more you look into it, there does seem to have been an engineered blowout, that it blew out the way it did so that certain people were going to collect. And so in the United States, the cost was small to medium-sized banks, and you had these predatory P2P lenders that are in this gray area of as functioning as quasi-banks. So we don't have yet, like Google or Amazon or Apple are not allowed to have their own banks. But for instance, Lending Club, actually both Lending Club and Prosper have worked very closely with Google in particular, but also eBay is involved. So you can see that they're moving in a direction where they want to have these kinds of fintech companies, financial technology companies, who are going to give out loans, and they're going to act like banks, and they're going to outcompete whatever is left of small to medium-sized banks. So then you only have the bigger banks. And ironically, it's the bigger banks like Goldman Sachs or Morgan Stanley or JP Morgan who are actually backing up these predatory fintech companies like Prosper and Lending Club. And the other important note on this is that especially Prosper, the co-founder, Chris Larsen, is known as a social credit pioneer. So some people might have been annoyed that I'm saying social credit system, and they're like, it's not really a social credit system, it's a social credit score. And it's like, it is actually like, this is the direction. What people are fearful of for an Orwellian social credit system is exactly what the social credit score is of these predatory lenders, because they're making up their own algorithms. So these P2P lenders don't use the standard algorithm of social credit. They're making their own algorithm, and now they're working with and they're working with companies like Google directly. So it is already a system where, as these kinds of big companies like Google start to take over more and more of how any kind of transactions are occurring, it's going to be very easy to have a reward or punishment system where you're just banning someone off of the platform. And you can't really say that it's infringing on civil liberties, right? Because it's like, it's their privilege. It's a privilege to use their service. It's not, you can say, an essential service, but as it takes over more and more, it's harder to function, without it. And also it's just easier, I think, to nudge people in a certain way. So it is actually a social credit system, the very thing that is being, that China is being accused of. And as I was looking into this, I found out that Alibaba and Tencent are pretty much Goldman Sachs creations, amongst other things, but Goldman Sachs is very much behind the scenes in a massive way on this, and that this all ties into Project Stargate directly, OpenAI, but most importantly, when it was brought into China in 2007. So this is all happening so tightly together. It was clear that these Chinese P2P lenders would not have existed if it hadn't been for the British American algorithms that started with these P2P loans, because these algorithms are actually quite complex. So I find that the timing is, again, it's very clear that these algorithms were brought into China, but also other places. And it was a kind of Trojan horse, because they also were acting as quasi-banks, and it was to attack the banking system, the financial system, as it did also within the United States and Britain. So it's a form of a big tech takeover, but they're working with the big banks, certain, big banks. And, it's a takeover to take it away from a kind of, more people-oriented system of banking, which the United States did have more of a system like that once upon a time before everything continued to be deregulated and Wall Street, was like the economy just became more and more just a speculative casino gambling economy. But it wasn't always like that in the United States. They had banks that actually were doing essential services, which is the whole point of a bank, right? Is to give out loans so that the economy can thrive and grow, businesses can develop and grow. So this I find is a whole engineered operation for big tech to actually take over these kinds of essential services. It's like COVID too, where like the small businesses and medium-sized businesses suffered the most. It was a form of centralizing it into certain hands, and the 2008 is the same thing. And we're now in the midst of another financial crisis. And the CEO of Goldman Sachs back in 2008, Larry Finkine or something like that, he's saying that he smells another crash coming, which I think is, again, an engineered one. Not that the system is doing well, but they're engineering it in a certain way so that it's going to, again, go into certain hands to collect. And the people are going to have less and less with this, outcome.
Interestingly, Tencent, one of its biggest shareholders, is a South African company called Naspers, which is Afrikaans for Nasionale Pers, which means national press. Huge shareholder.
Yeah, they're about 26%. The other thing too to note is that when you're looking, for instance, the biggest P2P lender that was caught committing fraud in China and was shut down, and it went up to like a lot, like over $10 billion was implicated in fraud with this. They were registered in the British Virgin Islands. You look at Alibaba, it's registered in the Cayman Islands. Tencent is registered in the Cayman Islands. And you have BlackRock and Vanguard that are also having a significant amount of stake in these companies. So yeah, it's when you actually look at it, the people who have stake in Alibaba and Tencent, they're all Western oriented, and they all pretty much overlap with Project Stargate. You actually don't have any major Chinese stake in these companies. You just have what's called the golden share, which is 1%, which is a newer thing that happened because these Alibaba and Tencent were also acting as P2P lenders. China had to rein it in 2020. And they basically said, if you want to act like a bank, you need to be regulated like a bank. Like, that shouldn't be controversial. And they also had a stake of 1% golden share, where they were now in a position where they could agree, they could approve or veto what these companies decide to do. Because, when you're that big now, like they're still huge in China, but they're not able to do P2P lending anymore because it wasn't going to be financially profitable for them, because they also didn't have skin in the game. And they were lending huge amounts, and there was a crisis that hit China between 2013 and 2018. Their 2008 type situation happened between those years, and it was because of the P2P loans, which again was a foreign entry into China. So when Jack Ma was taken down a few pegs in 2020, it was totally around this, as well as the fact that they were also doing the social credit scoring that was coming in from these P2P algorithms, and they were doing a reward punishment system, and China actually intervened on that. So yeah, it's quite striking that it was a foreign thing when you look at it.
Now, you've mentioned Stargate a few times. I remember when Trump proudly announced Stargate in conjunction with pharmaceutical companies, OpenAI, Oracle. I'm forgetting some of the names. And I think Starlink even is going to be part of it as part, in terms of its mass surveillance data collection. I mean, this is not Chinese.
It's yeah, and it's weird because people who tend to support Trump, they tend to not like Peter Thiel, and they tend to not like the Project Stargate concept, but they're of the view that somehow Trump is going to be able to rein this in. But Project Stargate was started during Trump's administration, and the two big co-founders of this are OpenAI, which holds 40%, and Japan's SoftBank, which owns 40%. And again, interestingly, the biggest tech fund or technocracy fund, you can say, is owned by SoftBank. It's called the Vision Fund, which is, again, totally all about the Project Stargate stuff, but it's headquartered in London, England. And again, interestingly, Alibaba wouldn't have gotten its start, which was $25 million for Jack Ma's concept. That was totally because Goldman Sachs gave its blessing through Joseph Tsai, who's, I don't think we'll have time, but I go through how Joseph Tsai is really the person behind the Alibaba growth and success, and Tencent, it's really Martin Lau, and both of these people are tied to Goldman Sachs, who built up these companies, and so Goldman Sachs is there at the very beginning for Alibaba, and SoftBank pretty much invests $20 million into Alibaba at the very beginning, because Goldman Sachs gave the blessing. And when you look at what SoftBank is investing in, it's everything to do with Project Stargate, including Uber, DoorDash. There's things like open homes where they're buying and purchasing and selling homes online. Like everything is being moved to an online platform. And Project Stargate is very much behind this, but you can see it's clearly being advised through Goldman Sachs. And again, very telling that the fund for all of this is headquartered in London, England. What's interesting is that when China clamped down on Jack Ma, and basically Alibaba not only could not function as a bank anymore, which was a huge blow to what the agenda is, but that China was going to reserve the right to clamp down and say no to whatever direction if they thought it was going to be a threat to society. That year, Jack Ma is removed from the board of SoftBank. He was on that board for 13 years, and SoftBank dropped all investment within 2 years of that decision. So that's for me, that shows that the fact that Goldman Sachs, which is also very much behind Project Stargate, basically most of its investment at this point is tied into Project Stargate. And people can look at my paper, The True Origins of China's Social Credit System, on my Substack through Glass Darkly for the details, because as you mentioned, it's a crazy long paper. There's just no way I can say all of the details here. But Goldman Sachs is basically the advisor, manager, shaper of Project Stargate through all of the financial avenues and so forth and funding. So it's very interesting that SoftBank is there at the very beginning for Alibaba, and then when China intervenes, they drop Alibaba in 2020. It shows you that Alibaba was always contingent on the Project Stargate thing, and that they were a foreign entry into China. And then they gave up on that project when China, blocked it. But Yeah. Anyway,
So,
I don't know if I'm rambling. It's a lot of
this is-
information.
yeah, I mean, what's so funny to me is in Trump's first term, he proudly announced warp speed. In his second term, he proudly announces Stargate, which is basically social credit scoring on steroids. And his supporters have a huge blind spot when it comes to this.
Yeah, they don't want to look at it. And then what's also very concerning, and you can see the connection between BlackRock and Stargate through the board of OpenAI. Also, on a quick side note, the banks who formed the Alibaba IPO were all Western banks: Credit Suisse, Deutsche Bank, Goldman Sachs, JP Morgan, Morgan Stanley, and Citigroup for Alibaba's IPO. And for Tencent's IPO, it was UBS and Merrill Lynch. So, and again, they're registered in the Cayman Islands, both of them, which is, not anyone can just get registered in the offshore tax haven of the City of London. Like, you basically have to be a part of the club to get that arrangement. But if you look at who's on the board of OpenAI, and also Goldman Sachs is handling OpenAI's IPO as we speak. But who's on the board of OpenAI is Adebayo Ogunlesi, who's the chairman of GIP. He's actually a huge player, but the GIP is purchased by BlackRock, and that's pretty much working for BlackRock. And you have Microsoft. And so an important part of this other part of the story where, to counter China's Belt and Road Initiative, the G7 started an initiative called Global Partners, GIPP, I think, Global Investment Partnership, whatever. And they tasked BlackRock and Microsoft as leaders to basically buy up infrastructure around the world to counter China's Belt and Road Initiative. First of all, China is investing in other countries to build up infrastructure that those countries ultimately own. Whereas these entities like BlackRock, which is the largest asset manager in the world, managing over 11 trillion of billionaire money, they're buying up infrastructure so that it's privately owned. Including London airports, Malaysian airports. So they're not building things, they're trying to acquire them. And that was part of the Panama controversy, because BlackRock wanted to buy 43 out of the 53 ports of CK Hutchison around the world. And China blocked that. And Panama has recently seized those 2 ports and given it to the Mediterranean Shipping Company, which was the company also working with BlackRock on that deal. And that company has been found trafficking cocaine several times. Actually, there's a lot of overlap with a lot of this and the opium situation. Again, it's too much to go over, but these are the kinds of people who are also on the board of OpenAI, who is a 40% stakeholder of Project Stargate. So you see, like, what I was just going over with the whole acquiring everything onto through fintech, acquirement and quasi banks. But then you have also the purchase or seizure of strategic essential infrastructure around the world, so that increasingly you can even say that the airports are going to be privately owned. They're not going to be publicly owned. And so they can decide whether you have the right to use it or not, sort of arrangement. So these are very concerning. And I people have to really start looking at this and addressing it. It's amazing that Project Stargate was announced in such an open way, like you say, and there hasn't been really any discussion about what this is and what its intention is from Trump supporters.
It seems like a very typical case of look over there. It's not while it's happening under their noses, they're not seeing it.
Or blaming China, right? Blaming China the whole time while it's like happening under their noses.
Now, what's interesting is the term itself, and you cover this also in your paper, social credit. We constantly get told that China's social credit is the example that the West wants to follow. Yet the phrase itself comes out of the British Empire in the early 1900s.
Yeah, that is something that Matt is going to be more adept at. I'm going to be going over that in part 3, and I haven't done too much work on it. But yeah, it starts out of the British Empire, and there's also a lot of connection with South Africa in this, which again is interesting because, as you mentioned, one of the major stakeholder of Tencent, 26 to 29% ownership of Tencent is this South African process Naspers, which is actually 2 entities that kind of own each other. And one of them, I think it was Process, was involved in the apartheid. So, and again, South Africa has a British Empire history. So you see a lot of British connection throughout this whole thing. But yeah, social credit also played a role in South Africa as a sort of experiment for that. Elon Musk's grandfather is also tied to this, who comes from South Africa and has, his Technocracy Inc. concept. So Elon Musk's, view, I think, is very much in line and he's continuing what his grandfather was working on. So these are clear avenues that, people have to look into more. I don't know if you have.
Catherine Austin Fitz actually talked about Elon's Starlink and how data is going to be the massively fought over currency in the coming years. Now, Starlink is not Chinese.
Yeah. And Starlink also has like a crazy amount of power and control, and it's amazing how many people are actually purchasing into this and want to be users of that system, thinking it's somehow, gonna like increase your freedom in the world, when there's a lot to be concerned and suspicious about. But yeah, I mean, I don't know what to say. It's like you keep looking into this stuff, and China is really not spearheading anything. And if you even look at the whole AI thing, there's a huge cultural difference of like how China is handling AI versus the West. And what an interesting point too is that people in China, they're not so concerned about AI because there is more trust, and there's actually, I know this might be shocking to some people, but there's actually more trust and optimism of like where things are going in China, that they don't see AI as, some kind of scary thing, because, and I'm also of that viewpoint, AI is a tool. And if you use that tool, responsibly, and you don't worship it like a god, then there's no problem. There's not that much difference even in like doing a Google search where you're asking certain kinds of questions. You're using it as a tool. The internet as a tool is a very useful thing, but it can also be a really bad thing. AI is just another extension of that. But in the US, we have a lot of cynicism, or in the West in more general, we have a lot of cynicism around AI. But then ironically, we also have this massive flux of, asking ChatGPT these major questions of meaning and like very general questions of purpose and intention, which you shouldn't be asking AI. You can ask AI things like things for like, what was the date that this treaty was signed, or what's the population of this, or blah, 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 right? Like you ask it very direct questions. You don't ask AI to explain to you the meaning of things or like the purpose of life, or people are asking AI, hey, I'm depressed. What should I do? I broke up with my girlfriend or whatever. Like they're treating it like it's some kind of counselor, or in a lot of cases too, people are even treating it like it's omniscient, and, perfectly objective in how it's going to answer your questions. And so it's funny, it strikes me that we have this kind of phenomenon that happened very quickly since the beginning of 2025. Like people have changed quite a bit in how they're even forming their thinking, especially young people are getting a scary dependent on asking things like ChatGPT questions to everything that they're thinking. And yet we have the cynicism of AI, and we've been brainwashed by Hollywood to only think negatively about any kind of technological advancement. Meanwhile, in China, the living standard is actually increasing. The age now, the average life expectancy in China is higher than in the United States, which is insane. Thinking where China was like 20 years ago. Like that is a real measure of a boost in quality of living that you really can't, deny. Or if you've actually visited China, you would also see like there is a crazy amount of development in a really positive direction, and also beautiful. The cities are beautiful. They're not just these concrete jungles. There are parks, and there's the way that they're even formatted and everything. It's very nice looking.
Yes, I can confirm. Shanghai itself is stunning. It's this massive city, and in the center, it is beautiful.
Yeah, well, like when TikTok was like temporarily banned for Americans, and they went on to Red Note, and they saw how like the average Chinese person was living, which is actually better than a lot of Americans. I know it's shocking and surprising, but if you went onto Red Note, you would have seen these things, or you can even go onto YouTube and ask like, hey, Red Note reactions. And yeah, the price of food is way cheaper too. Like food inflation is like crazy right now in the West. The living standard, the rent, everything, it's way more affordable compared to the salary that you're earning. And the taxes are way lower, and also they don't tax you on certain things that you're taxed here in the West. Like once you own your apartment or your house, you own it. They can't take it from you. It's insane that in the West that can happen if you technically own your home. Or now if someone passes away and they want to leave their house to their children, you get taxed like an insane amount. I forgot how much, but it's like over 50%. And it's clear why they're doing that, because most people are not going to be able to afford that, and they're going to have to sell that house. Who's going to buy that house? Chances are something like Blackstone, which is what's happening in the United States. Like most people now, in their middle ages or younger, they can't afford to buy a house. Who's buying up all of these houses as the older generation is passing away? It's companies like Blackstone. So that's not happening in China. When someone owns something, they own it. So people have to really, I think, do a little bit more work to actually look at like what is actually happening in China and what is actually happening in your own country, and maybe, direct your attention accordingly.
I think, Cynthia, there is also a huge disconnect in language usage. In the West, the term social credit has a very different meaning, like many other words and phrases in China. I mean, I noticed that when I was there, things don't mean the same thing because of the fact that it's a whole different society, culture, history, everything. Listen to this. I found this this online. What the term social credit means in China. not one national quote-unquote Black Mirror score. Independent China analysts, including the West's own Merrick's think tank, call the single citizen score idea more boogeyman than reality. It's a lowly digitized, highly fragmented, and primarily focuses on businesses. It's really an umbrella term for several separate things. Corporate compliance databases, so in other words, A to D company risk ratings to decide how hard to inspect a business, a judicial blacklist of court debt dodgers, which has blocked people from buying flights and high-speed train tickets, and local city pilots, and there are a few cities that tried scoring, jaywalking, littering, and even online game cheating. But these personal scoring pilots were criticized inside China itself and largely walked back. By 2019, central authorities explicitly stated scores could not be used to penalize citizens, and surviving schemes are now basically voluntary loyalty points programs with no teeth. And lastly, it was openly modeled on Western systems, explicitly inspired by FICO in the US and Scufa in Germany.
Yeah, that was a useful run through.
I mean, that is exactly the problem. That there's a disconnect in the way in which language is used, because if you do something wrong in your company, it goes without saying that you're going to get penalized.
Yeah, I mean, again, like what you were using the example of someone driving. Obviously, and we do have a sort of point, not a point system, but like you can have like a 3 strikes sort of thing on your license, and then you lose your license. And I mean that's not a bad thing. Obviously, these things can be abused. Anything can be abused, but at the same time, like you need to have some accountability of responsibility when you're driving, and there has to be the right to remove someone's license if they're not responsible. So again, like it would be great to live in a world where we don't need to have laws, and you know, I know that some people who are you know, a bit more extreme in thinking that the government shouldn't play any role in anything, but I haven't heard anyone who thinks that lay out a detailed explanation of how things are supposed to function properly without some kind of overseeing. Like people have never been able to just self-manage or self-regulate, and if you have problems with crime, who's going to deal with it, right? I do think that if there's a responsible level of dealing with things, which the United States also was like, they were not in a bad place. There has been a lot of infiltration within the United States from bad players, and especially since, you know, the assassination of Kennedy, there has been a lot of what you could say a deep state takeover, and the CIA, for instance, too, just like, you know, moving from what was originally supposed to be a desk job position to increasingly like basically controlling the U.S. military in a very large way. Like, for instance, Vietnam War, that was basically a CIA run operation. A lot of this kind of stuff has been happening over decades, and the big tech phenomenon is not separate from this. It's actually an arm of Gladio. For people who don't know Gladio, it's like the paramilitary operations, NATO's secret army type stuff. People can find out more about that on my Substack as well.
It's the largest covert operation in history.
Yeah, like all of these operations they're black ops. I know that's a scary thing I just said. I hate to break it to you, but it's like Operation Phoenix for everybody. And we have to realize what this is. It's very serious, but the thing that I always try to get people to think of, because I know that's a lot to handle, is it matters what you think. That's why there's still so much effort to have so much disinformation, to have so many influencers right now, whether it's in the alternative media space or semi-alternative mainstream, like Tucker Carlson, for instance. It's all to channel who you're going to blame, because things are going to get worse and worse, and people are going to get really pissed off, and they're going to try to direct that energy at anything but what it should be directed at. So you have to be aware of that. And I mean, don't take my word for it, but like, you have to do a little bit of work and figure out like who is behind these things. Like in the paper that I just did on China's social credit, the true origins of China's social credit, just look at, this is like, I think something that everyone agrees on, who is funding what. And when you look at who is funding these projects, they're all the same players. And again, Goldman Sachs plays a huge role. SoftBank, which is working for this and is a co-founder of Project Stargate, along with OpenAI. This is all like so consistently tied together with a nice ribbon. Like it's very clear where the direction is in all of this. And I'm sorry, but like Trump is the one who brought this online with Project Stargate. He's the one who is working closely with Peter Thiel, and not really counter to Elon Musk either.
A few minutes ago, I was telling you what social credit means in China. Now, from that same piece that I found, here's what social credit looks like in the West. Credit scores, such from FICO, Experian, Equifax, for example, already gate your access to housing, loans, jobs, and insurance, a numerical trustworthiness rating most people didn't consent to. ESG scores are increasingly used in corporate credit ratings, and even a FICO analyst predicted ESG data would get more granular at the individual level. Critics, including Fox Business, have openly called ESG, quote, a social credit system designed to transform society, unquote. Debanking payment processor blacklisting, for example, being cut off by your bank or PayPal or Visa for political or reputational reasons, which is arguably a more immediate and less accountable punishment than anything in a Chinese pilot. Now, here's what's interesting. During COVID, PayPal was killing loads of accounts. I don't know if you remember, for going against vaccine mandates, for example. I was using PayPal at the time, and I was thinking, no, hang on. I gotta stop using PayPal.
Yeah, well,
social credit.
Exactly, and Stripe as well. It's scary how much we rely on just a few entities for transactions, unless you can do like a direct bank to bank transfer. It's quite a monopoly on like how these kinds of things happen, and it affected a lot of people, including us. Matt had his PayPal shut down, and they still don't allow him to have a PayPal account. And another note I want to really make clear to people is that this P2P predatory lending, where they're acting as quasi-banks, they're working with entities like Google, and they're having their own social credit algorithms working with Google. They're still functioning in the West. China, they didn't ban it, but they said that you need to be regulated like a bank, such that it wasn't financially viable for these entities to do it anymore. And so there is no more P2P lending at all happening in China since 2020. And Alibaba and Tencent, again, they were doing P2P loans, and then that part of their business, which was actually the largest part of Alibaba's business, and I think even Tencent, because it was that lucrative, they had to shut it down because they were forced, to have skin in the game. And so obviously, if you're going to give out predatory loans that are going to have a high chance of defaulting, you don't want to have skin in the game with that. So that's another big thing for people to realize. Like, it's not this like, oh, China is, people constantly are just saying, but they just say it, right? They're not actually proving or bringing up a point. It's like, whatever. Obviously, China is in on it. Obviously, China is benefiting on it. Obviously, the government was making money off of this. The government shut it down. It's not shut down in the West. It's still functioning and growing in the West.
And I think, Cynthia, something also that has just struck me is that the quote-unquote social credit scoring in China is effectively run by the state, while in the US and I guess Western countries as a whole, it's run by, as you say, fintech, private companies. The difference is that in China, you can see what the government is wanting to do in many ways. With private companies, it's hard because it's decentralized, and in some aspects, decentralization is a good thing. In this instance, it's not, because they are incredibly powerful, as you pointed out.
And they haven't been operating in good faith, because
sorry for interrupting, but you're right. They haven't been operating in good faith because they're working together with the US government. For example, Trump announced Stargate.
Yeah, and like a huge part of their platform was predatory lending to begin with. Like, for instance, DoorDash partnered with the Swedish fintech company called Klarna, and it's this buy now, pay later model, right? And you can see, like, they're not going to be the only ones to use this, where they're encouraging people to get into debt, and they want the population to be in debt, because then there's a certain amount of control that they can have over you once once you owe them money. It's like owing money to the mafia kind of thing. It's like, it's not really that different. And by the way, Trump was like mentored by Roy Cohn, who was a big mafia guy, American mafia guy. These are mafia techniques. I don't know.
So, I mean, I guess it could be argued that the West actually runs a more pervasive social credit scoring system.
Yes, I think that the China again intervened because there are people still that have debt owed, but I think China was also investigating, and they were looking into trying to clear up some of these things. But in the US, the economy, and this is for the West in general as well, but the US especially, it's a debtor economy. But the thing is that when you're a big bank or you're a big business, you get write-offs, you have all of these loopholes. If you're the average Joe, whether it's a small business or a small bank or an individual, you get stuck largely with the debt of these other entities on top of it, because it's a trickle-down effect. Everything is getting poorer except for within a few hands. So,
Cynthia, how can I follow your work?
You can follow my work on my Substack, Through Glass Darkly. And the paper that we're discussing is The True Origins of China's Social Credit System. Again, it's four parts. In the second part, I'm going to be going over in more detail what China actually did to clamp down on this. I will also be going over throughout this series the origins of social credit. As you mentioned, it has a British South African tie to it, but how China views AI and how AI is functioning in China versus the United States, and then also on China's digital banking system and how this is actually countering the big tech attempt to take over banking.
All right, Cynthia Chung, thank you for joining me in the trenches.
Thank you for having me.